When the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were attacked on September 11th of 2001, everything in the United States was brought to a halt for the day, into the week, and in some examples, through months. This slowing is not limited to airports or Disneyland's attendance, or the decision to repay the attacks tenfold through the War on Terror, claiming tens of thousands of the lives of civilians in Iraq, and creating an excuse that is still the fuel for long-term Islamophobia. 9/11 was a tragedy for all victims involved, and since the topic of the video today does discuss the event, I do want to mention that I feel for the families of those harmed by it, both from the US and the Middle East. Among changes that had to be made to the country's security were also changes that had to be made to address the sensitivity of the topic of anything related. And with so many action-oriented movies and adventures in video games relying on big explosions and city chases, a whole lot of media being created during and after the initial few months of shock had to be edited or even completely changed out of respect for the lives lost. Today we're going to examine some media that had to be edited because of 9/11. Before Tom Holland and Andrew Garfield were ever Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire was the titular hero that many children looked up to as a young role model, having to go through things that no teenager such as him should. A boy who finds himself developing spider powers after being bitten by a radioactive spider, Peter Parker uses these powers to stop bad guys both on a street level and big bad villain level. He balances his life as a normal boy with his Spider-Man persona, which becomes difficult at times both for himself and the relationships he has with other people. Despite any struggle Peter Parker may go through, Spider-Man becomes the unspoken hero of New York. And since this is true, most, if not all, Spider-Man movies are set in New York. And this includes the first cinematic Spider-Man movie, which came out in 2002, a year after the attacks on the World Trade Center. Filming on the movie began in 2000, with the movie being planned to release in November of the next year. With the movie being set in New York and Spider-Man's primary method of traveling being done across the skyline of the city, multiple shots of the World Trade Center were included in recordings, and made it to what was supposed to be the finalized cut of the movie. With the attacks happening only 2 months before the movie was set to release, Sony found it to be more respectful to the lives lost if they could remove the towers digitally from every shot that included them. A shot focusing more on the towers that could impossibly have them adequately removed was deleted from the movie entirely, but this shot was still used on Sony's stock footage website. Not only were the towers removed from the movie completely, but lines delivered by civilians were added to reference the wave of patriotism being felt in the months after the attacks. The lines, "You mess with Spidey, you mess with New York," and "You mess with one of us, you mess with all of us," were added as a representation of the feelings Americans had towards those responsible for the tragedy. Another scene was added to both the movie and trailers from later in the movie's advertisement campaign that showed Spider-Man hanging onto a flagpole bearing an American flag, again as a nod to America as a whole, and the sense of togetherness felt after having been made to feel so vulnerable. Spider-Man was only one of the many movies that had to have shots of the Twin Towers removed out of respect for what had happened to them. Zoolander, which was set to premiere in theaters just 3 weeks after the attacks, had them digitally removed, as did the movie Stuart Little 2. Some older movies were even edited out of respect, or because certain scenes were so similar to the attacks. The 1998 movie Armageddon released with a scene where the World Trade Center is struck by meteors and set on fire, but this scene was removed from any TV airings of the movie from the date of the attacks onward. Disney doesn't always make a whole lot of action movies, and Lilo Stitch isn't necessarily one, but I would say it's got more typical action elements just because of its sci-fi subject matter. Lilo Stitch is about a young Hawaiian girl, Lilo, whose home life and outgoing, exciting personality eventually lead to her being a little cast out from other children. She wishes to have a normal life, and to have a friend by her side that understands her and supports her. To help her with this, her older sister Nani takes her to adopt a dog from the same shelter where a space criminal, Experiment 626, later renamed to Stitch by Lilo, ended up after escaping his pending sentencing and imprisonment. The movie revolves around Stitch's creators, the alien scientists Jumba and Pleakley, hunting him down to return him to where he belongs. Production of the movie started sometime in the 2000s and was meant to be a budgetarily scaled-back movie when compared to some of the blockbusters Disney had been producing in the 90s. This would later benefit the production in a few ways. The initial cut of the movie had featured a scene where Pleakley and Jumba fly a Boeing 747 through a city in Honolulu, similar to the makeup of New York. They don't ever crash the plane at any point, but even the action of flying a plane through a city felt too resemblant of the incident, especially since the plane they were flying was a Boeing, a model of which was used in the attacks. At a pretty large expense for the budget of the movie, this scene had to be reanimated and somewhat rewritten to adapt to the change in both the vehicle and setting. The Boeing was replaced with a spacecraft, and instead of flying through a city, the craft would simply fly across a beach. This didn't necessarily eat too much at all into the money provided for the movie, and the production team was luckily able to add 2 more minutes of footage to the film that focused on the newfound relationship between Lilo, Stitch, and Nani. The movie was supposed to release sometime in 2001, but was subsequently moved to 2002 to allow for these changes to be made. Lilo and Stitch is nowadays hailed as one of Disney's better 2D animated features, so it's probably better that this scene was changed so as not to bring the movie's initial reception down. Not only the movie industry was impacted by cautions being taken to be considerate of the events of 9/11, these sentiments also bled over to the small screen and affected select episodes or plot lines of programming. This even includes children's programming, and specifically for this example, SpongeBob. The show SpongeBob SquarePants and its titular character is a show that probably needs a lot of introduction, which I'm not gonna give. One episode of this show, titled Just One Bite, which released on October 5th of 2001, a month after the attacks, concerns one of SpongeBob's co-workers, Squidward, breaking into the Krusty Krab in order to get a Krabby Patty, after SpongeBob mocks him for never having had one. Upon trying one, Squidward develops an obsession for them, leading to him breaking into the Krusty Krab like this to get to the Patty Vault, which for some reason contains hundreds of already made sandwiches. At first, Squidward is surprisingly met with no security system in the restaurant, and much to his surprise, the only line of defense is seemingly a bucket of water over the front door of the establishment. Upon further inspection, he smells gasoline and the bucket pours it everywhere, and a lit match is used to ignite it, causing an explosion that sets the intruder on fire. He makes it to the kitchen, now scorched, but is again bathed in gasoline and lit on fire before he makes it to where the Patty Vault is located. After the first airing of this episode, the sequence was removed entirely, presumably because the attacks involved an explosion similar, and that one of the functioning theories at the time was that the attack's level of destruction was caused by the plane's fuel igniting. The version of the episode with this scene still intact can be viewed pretty easily. In 2002, the episode re-aired with the removed scene being replaced with a zoom-in shot of the Patty Vault. It's not entirely sure if the scene was removed because of the attacks, but I'm sure it had at the very least some factor in deciding. A member of the show's production team, Vincent Waller, stated in 2018 that the decision was Nickelodeon's itself, who basically said that they didn't really like the inclusion of a gag about igniting gasoline, in fear that children would try and replicate it, even though they'd had similarly violent gags in both this show and other shows prior to this. GTA, or Grand Theft Auto, is a series of games where you play as a character who finds themselves wrapped up in criminal activity for various reasons depending on the entry. Each game is also set in a different city, some entirely fiction, some loosely based on real cities, and some set in actual recreated video game versions of a real city. The city featured in GTA 3 was based on New York in a loose fashion, named Liberty City after one of New York's landmarks. Initial production on the game started around the time that the second installment had been released. The game itself, while set in a New York-based town, did not feature any depiction of the Twin Towers, or include any plot points or animations that resembled the events like in other examples in this video. This one goes to show that even the most minor changes were considered when handling the subject. GTA 3 was set to release on October 3rd of 2001, but the attacks on the Twin Towers prompted the game's publisher, Rockstar Games, to push the release back by about 3 weeks. This was done not only because they now wanted to make minor alterations to the game, but also because their offices were close to Ground Zero, and a lot of the employees had relatives and friends who were either hurt or impacted by the attacks. The game's release date was eventually pushed to October 23rd of 2001, and released with some changes that were made between this date and the attacks. The police cars shown in the game had their paint jobs changed to a common black and white color scheme after they had initially been colored more similar to the NYPD's police cars. Other, less noticeable changes were made to avoid any unfortunate similarities to the attacks or references to it. The flight path of a non-player controlled plane was changed to be moved further away from the skyscrapers and buildings of Liberty City. A quest, or mission as they're called in GTA games, was removed because it referenced terrorism, and there were lines of NPC dialogue that had to be cut because of similar references to matters regarding danger like that. Before Toys R Us's untimely demise and their recent resurgence in Macy's stores, the chain saw its peak in the late 90s and early 2000s, as most toy brands themselves did. It was a good span of years for the growth and development of Toys R Us, and this period of good wealth led the company to make a decision to build a flagship store in Times Square, which would act not only as a toy store but also as an attraction, with rides, games, and interactive features, similar to the FAO Schwarz toy store in New York. This store would also sell exclusive toys as one of its most important revenue points. making it so you could pretty much only get that specific toy there, thus it being exclusive to Times Square. An example of this, and the one I will be discussing, is an exclusive Barbie doll, sold for the location's grand opening in November of 2001. The attacks on their own would end up impacting the store's tourism point, with people being afraid to travel for months after September 11th, on top of security changes having to be made to airports and air travel. However, they would also impact the exclusive Barbie, whose packaging showed a silhouette of the New York skyline, with the Twin Towers included on the left-hand side. Since the doll and packaging were more than likely designed months prior to the attacks, the inclusion of the towers on the packaging had to be fixed after the store opened, with the Barbies needing to be pulled from the shelf so the store could eventually roll out packaging without them. I'm not entirely sure that this happened before they sold any, as the Barbies were intended to be one of their biggest sales points on their opening day. These Barbies can still be found being sold today, but I can't find any that have the original packaging with the Twin Towers, rather the edited packaging without them, which instead now shows a giant Ferris wheel, as featured in the New York Times Square Toys R Us itself. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I tried to remain as serious as possible because of the subject matter. I hope that came across well. I just find a lot of interest in the changes that had to be made to things because of it, so I just wanted to make a video about it.